who's traveled all the way from St. Paul, Minnesota, to be with us this evening. He is an emissary of the Lubavitch Rebbe. He's a theologian, he's a philosopher, but he's also someone who takes his message to a very wide audience. He's the dean of the Beth Hana Women's Institute, and he's also the first rabbi ever to have a nationally syndicated TV show on personal problems and on the problems of culture of the 1990s. It's a privilege to have him here tonight, and I'd like to ask you all to give him the warmest possible welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a talk about intimacy, so please make yourself at home. Feel comfortable. Just very briefly on three very large subjects: intimacy, modesty, and sexuality. I think we can all agree on a beginning point, and that is that in our society, in the world today, in the free world certainly, there is an intimacy crisis. We have a problem with intimacy. We're afraid of intimacy. And we agonize over the lack of intimacy. What better indication or what better proof of our discomfort with intimacy than the euphemisms that we use to describe what should be very intimate relationships. It used to be that rather intimate relationships were described as dating, which is a strange word to use. Of course, people don't use that anymore. We don't call it dating anymore because it sounded very much like something out of a geology class. I'm dating Howard or Lucy. So it was changed to going out. Remember when people used to go out? And that was used to describe, again, some rather intimate relationships. Now, we might argue that the euphemism was used out of delicateness. We wanted to be polite about it, but I think it's gone beyond that. It's more of a buffer, more of a defense against intimacy. So we called it going out for a while. Everybody was going out. Are you going out? You going out tonight? Have you been going out? Are you going out with anybody? Everybody was going out. Nobody knew where anybody was going. And then the ultimate euphemism is in vogue today. You know what intimate relationships are called today? Seeing someone. Are you seeing anyone? I'm seeing someone. Now, one of these days, somebody's going to say to me, I'm seeing a very, very nice woman. And I'm going to say, can I see her too? Or better yet, will you show her to me? Whatever that means. Why the euphemisms? Probably because if you identify the relationship as an attachment, if you consider this a commitment, if you think that this is an investment of yourself in a relationship, and then if, God forbid, the relationship ends for whatever reason, it'll hurt. You will say, I was in this relationship and I lost it. We destroyed it. It didn't last. It fell apart. Too painful. So what you say instead is, oh, I'm seeing someone. Should this not work out? Okay, so I'm not seeing him. It sounds a lot less painful and safer. So we put this buffer, this safety coating around our relationships to keep a distance, to prevent it from becoming too painfully intimate. Now, obviously, intimacy implies vulnerability. if you're going to be intimate, you're going to allow people to see parts of yourself that you'd rather not have people see. You're going to allow someone into that part of your existence, into that part of your mind and heart that you're not exactly comfortable with yourself. And you don't know how the other person is going to treat it. And you don't know how it's going to feel to have someone else scrutinize that part of you that you're a bit ashamed of. But on the other hand, that's the whole meaning of an intimate relationship. The whole idea of intimacy is that we stop being alone. And the only way you stop being alone is if all of you, particularly that part of yourself that you're sensitive about, is no longer alone. If you can share that with another person, you have ended your loneliness. As long as that part of you is still alone, then you're alone. Intimacy is supposed to be the antidote to loneliness. And I think it would be safe to say that with all of our social skills and with all of our partying, we are basically a lonely people. A little Hasidic philosophy here for a moment. We know that we have freedom of choice. God tells us that we are given this unique quality. The angels don't have it. Animals don't have it. Only the human being has freedom of choice. When we stop to examine freedom of choice, we find that all of our activity, all of our functioning, works in a kind of a totem pole hierarchy, where one faculty depends on the other for input. So that, for example, a kid in school says, I know I ought to be studying, I ought to be concentrating, and I'd like to, but it just doesn't happen. I never get around to it. I don't know why. I can't get myself to actually sit down and study. Well, the answer would be that action is motivated, animated by thought. Where the thought stimulates action, then the action is more likely to occur. When the thought is not geared towards this action, even though you may know in some general vague way that you ought to do this, the action is not going to happen. The stimulation is not there. So in order to have the action, you have to have the thought. So now this kid says, okay, then I'll have the thought. Then I'll think it. And he tries, and of course it doesn't work. So he comes back to his mentor, to the witch doctor, and he says, what's wrong with me now? I'm thinking that I ought to learn, and I get down there and I open the book and nothing happens. So he's told that thought also needs motivation. Thought depends on feeling, on emotion. You have to have an emotional response. You have to warm to a subject. Then the thought of studying that subject will be a live, animating thought. It, in turn, will affect your behavior, and you will do it. So the kid says, okay, so fine. So give me the feeling. So I'll have the feeling. I'll warm to the subject. So he sits down and he tries to warm. Nothing happens. So he comes back to what's wrong now? Well, emotions are in the heart. The heart is encased in this rib case, surrounded by a chest, and it has no view of the outside world. It lives in the back, as the expression goes. It has no windows. So it depends on the mind for information. The heart cannot warm to a subject that the mind does not introduce to the heart. So first you have to have it in your mind. You have to understand the subject, and in your mind you have to be convinced that this is the subject you ought to learn. You also have to be convinced, by the way, that it's you who should be doing the studying, and that it should be now. Otherwise, it doesn't come together. But if in your mind you are convinced that this is what you ought to learn today, then you will study it. Then the heart will warm to the idea, because the heart gets its direction from the mind. The heart will then animate the thought will activate the actions, and you'll actually study. So the kid says, fine, I'm going to figure out and convince myself that I ought to be studying this subject. And he tries and it doesn't work. He can't convince himself. And so he's told that conviction depends on will. You have to want the subject. Then your mind is stimulated to absorb the subject. Then your mind stimulates your heart to warm to the subject. Then your heart stimulates a living thought, and a living thought can get some action going. Now, what does all this do to freedom of choice? If a person says, I have freedom of choice, I think I'm going to go. No, well, you're not really going to go unless you have a thought behind it. So, okay, fine, then I'll have the thought. Well, you can't really have the thought yet. You first have to have an emotion. So where does this leave freedom of choice? What it boils down to is, those things you really want, you can do. If you don't want, then you can't do it. Because your mind won't be behind it, your heart won't be in it, your thoughts won't be alive, your actions won't happen. So freedom of choice is really quite limited when it comes to behavior. Where then is this magnificent gift of freedom of choice? So Hasidic philosophy says like this. True freedom of choice consists of choosing your identity. Not so much your actions as your identification. With whom do you identify? Where do you belong? To whom do you belong? In Yiddish, an adult would meet a child in a shtetl or someplace in a Jewish community, and in Yiddish he would want to find out who this person is, who this child is, and the question would be, Wemens bist du? Whose are you? Not what is your name, but whose are you? Whose child are you? Whose son are you? Whose daughter are you? Where do you belong? That identification is where our freedom of choice really lies. We can, at any time, without any interference from any force in the world, we can choose where we belong. A person can be sitting in a Soviet prison with all of his freedoms taken away, except for the freedom to belong where he chooses to belong. His identity cannot be imposed, nor can it be taken away. So to use Sharansky as an example, Anatoly Sharansky was sitting in prison for 9 years. All his personal freedoms were taken away. He did exactly what the Russians told him to do, except for one thing. He did not belong there. He never belonged there, not for a moment. He belonged in Israel. In fact, as far as he was concerned, he was in Israel. He can place himself where he wants to be. That's the true freedom of choice. That freedom isn't dependent on anything else. You choose it, and it's there. It is the most powerful and the most available of all of our faculties, and yet this is the one thing we're afraid of. This is the one thing that terrifies us, and we run away. Do you identify with someone? Do you belong to someone? Would you cringe if somebody would say, are you so-and-so's wife? Does that feel uncomfortable? Oh, are you so-and-so's son? Does that hurt? Are these your children? Does that feel a little threatening? The truth is that we desperately want to be connected, to be joined, to belong, to be attached. The more attachments, the stronger we are, the healthier we are. At our school of Beis Chana a couple of years ago, there was a very unhappy woman who really wasn't ready to study, and it didn't work out, and she left after a couple of days. But the few days that she was there, she managed to antagonize everybody. A very unhappy woman. And one day in class, she had one of these outbursts, and she said, totally out of context, she said, what about people who come to the synagogue and all they do is talk, and they're not even there to pray? They disturb everybody else. It had nothing to do with what we were talking about, what we were studying. I said, whose synagogue are you talking about? She says, well, the synagogue back home where I live. Your synagogue? She says, no, not my synagogue. Because she does this to everybody. As soon as she's unhappy with something, she breaks the bond. She disconnects. It's not my synagogue. It's not my rabbi. She would be a much happier and healthier woman if she said, in my synagogue, all they do is talk. And it upsets me terribly. But it's my synagogue. And my rabbi couldn't even do anything about it. She may be disillusioned with her rabbi, but she would be a happier human being. Her marriages would be healthier. Her relationship with her children would be healthier. This belonging, this attachment. Sharansky had it. He chose where he belonged, and that saw him through the most difficult, the most torturous 9 years. And on the other side of the world, Mrs. Sharansky is running around working for the freedom of this man. They were only married for a week, less. And yet she was Mrs. Sharansky, motivated to 9 years of nonstop effort to free this man, because this man belonged to her, and she belonged with him. That kind of intimacy, that kind of attachment, is what intimacy is supposed to be. Think about it this way for a moment. A married couple, or best friends, you go out to a restaurant, and the husband, for example, reaches across the table and knocks the coffee onto his lap. Now imagine the wife turns to a perfect stranger sitting next on the table near them and says, he always does this. What she actually did in that little moment there is that when her husband does something embarrassing, she steps out of that relationship. They're suddenly strangers. She is suddenly more comfortable with the person sitting in the next table than with him. So she suddenly switches allegiances from this guy with the wet pants to the person sitting at the table next to her, and says, we will look at this guy and notice what a schlemazel he is, right? A couple come to a marriage counselor, the same kind of thing. The woman says to the marriage counselor in a conspiratorial tone of voice, can you figure him out? Who are you related to? Your husband or the counselor or the therapist? All of a sudden it's you and the therapist against him? No wonder this marriage isn't working. Intimacy means that you become attached. You become joined. You belong together. There are difficulties. There is embarrassment. It's your embarrassment, not his. It's a shared embarrassment. Whatever happens after that connection takes place, it's shared. It brings you closer together, not further apart. Intimacy means loyalty. Loyalty to an identity. If we run away from the identity, then we're ruining the relationship. We're undoing what is most precious to us. When that happens, the next thing that begins to suffer is our sexuality. For most human beings, at some stage in life, sexuality cannot and will not exist without intimacy. Rarely do you find a human being who prefers to separate the two. Certainly a sensitive human being cannot separate them. Where the intimacy is lost, sexuality is lost. That doesn't mean you can't function sexually, but it's not really sexual anymore. It's just physical. And then you start getting restless. You're discontent. And I think that in holistic medicine, the healers would agree that a frustrated or unsatisfied sexuality leads to all sorts of physical illness and ailments. Because if the inner person is out of sync, then the outer person, the physical body, begins to fall apart as well. Now, concerning sexuality, by the way, we need a bit of a definition. In spite of all that has been written and said about sexuality, we're still not quite clear. For example, this idea of bisexuality. Is it correct? Can it be said of an individual that this person is bisexual? Is that a correct statement? It's not. Because it is not unique to any one individual. Every human being is a sexual being. Bisexual is meaningless. Why not trisexual? Quadrosexual? I mean, just because a person can misbehave more than one way doesn't earn him a title. Anybody who is alive can behave in many different ways sexually. Some choose to do it, some choose not to do it. Some are afraid, some are not afraid. But to make it a title, say, oh, he is bisexual. Everyone is bisexual. Everyone is trisexual. Every human being is a sexual being. And we needn't have these hang-ups with these titles. I mean, even heterosexual is a silly word. A human being is a sexual being. There are preferred sexual behaviors, and there are condemned sexual behaviors. But it's the behavior that is preferred or condemned, not the person. The person is simply sexual. It's like eating. You may prefer one kind of food, somebody else may prefer another kind of food. I don't know of anybody who carries any kind of a title to go with that food preference. Sexuality, properly understood, is connected to intimacy. Intimacy means when you put aside this fear of exposure, when you overcome this resistance to being known, you know, the biblical knowing, Adam knew Eve. When you put aside the fear of being known and you allow a person into that part of your life that is maybe not so comfortable, then you have entered into an intimacy. You have brought another person into a place that is intimate, and that constitutes an intimacy. Properly understood, when a man and woman are together in a room and the door closes, that is a sexual event. Not because of what's going to happen, but what already happened. When togetherness in a room alone, or aloneness together in privacy between a man and a woman takes place, that is a sexual event. May not be something to make novels out of, but it is a sexual occurrence, because male-female is what sexuality used to be all about. What happened was that in putting up these defenses, in getting steeled, inured against the constant exposure and stimulation of men and women constantly sharing all sorts of activities, coeducational schools, coeducational camps, coeducational gym, what happens is that we have to start blocking out groups of people. We can't be as naturally sexual as God created us to be. When a person says, a man says, I have a friend, a woman friend, but we're just friends. Nothing more than that. I mean, there's no problem. Not really attracted to her in any sexual way. She's just not my type. Is that a sign of sophistication? Is this guy really together? Is this a guy who has self-control? Is this a disciplined person? Or is this a person who has died a little bit? A little death? First of all, if you have a friend of the opposite sex and you're really not attracted, don't tell them. Don't say it to them, because it is not a compliment. Secondly, what do you mean she's not your type? In the good old days, you know, Tarzan and Jane, the type was male and female. A man and a woman, a boy and a girl. That was the type. What do you mean she is not your type? She is female, and you are male. When did this typing come into existence? Too tall, too short, too this, too that. What is this? Well, first of all, it's artificial. It is not true to human sexuality. And second of all, it really isn't even true in this particular context. Because given a slight change of circumstances, you could very easily be attracted. Because, after all, it's male and female. How many times does a relationship begin as casual, neighborly, and then suddenly become intimate? I mean, they have a movie about it. The Great Awakening. This boy and girl are running around together, doing all sorts of things, sharing all sorts of activities, and lo and behold, they realize, what drama, what drama. They realize that they're attracted to each other. These are grown-ups, intelligent human beings. And it caught them by surprise. It's kind of silly. There's a story about an old man who was very ill and weak. And he was bedridden. This was in a shtetl someplace in Europe. And he couldn't take care of himself. So there was a woman, a neighbor, who was even older than him, who would come in every morning and give him some cereal. Feed him, spoon-feed him some cereal. Anyway, he sends this desperate message to his son. You must come immediately. This is terrible. This woman comes into my house every morning. This is not right. It's not modest. It's not chaste. I mean, it's terrible. The son comes. He says, Dad, what's your problem? You're 86 years old. You can't move. You're sick. You're ill. You're weak. She's 88 years old. What is your problem? What are you worried about? And the man said, I see you don't understand the evil inclination. You don't understand sexuality. Don't you realize that the evil inclination can make me well and her young? That is a healthy human being. That's a healthy male. Because that's how God created us. When we come along and we create these artificial typings, this is not my type, this is your type, this is It's not true. It simply isn't true. We do it, again, to protect ourselves. We can't afford to be attracted to everybody. One other thing. I think that by now, with all of our freedom and experimentation, we've discovered another thing. We can't afford to be attracted to everyone we meet. We also can't afford to get started on an attraction and then have to stop. That's deadening. So it seems that there's only one possible solution, and it's an ancient one. It's called modesty. Modesty means not only the way we dress, not only the way we socialize, but it's a whole attitude. It's a whole outlook on life itself. Modesty means an appreciation of that which is intimate and caution to prevent the intimate from becoming callous. That which is exposed loses its intimacy. That which is revealed is no longer private. And when you have nothing private and nothing intimate, then you cannot possibly experience an intimacy because you have no private place into which to bring another person. Basically, you have nothing to offer. When the Jews were traveling in the desert after leaving Egypt, 40 days after God spoke to them at Mount Sinai, they went ahead and created a golden calf. God was angry, they were punished, and then God says, if you want a physical place to identify as a place of godliness, as a place of holiness, then build me a sanctuary. So they went ahead and they gathered X amount of gold and X amount of silver and X amount of copper, and they put together this magnificent portable sanctuary. But to do that, they needed a lot of gold. So the commentaries ask, when they had given all their gold for the making of the golden calf, where did the gold for the tabernacle come from? And they give two answers. One answer is that women never participated in the golden calf. Women are not as quick to share their gold here meaning love, recklessly, carelessly. And so when people came along and said, let's make a golden calf, the women did not participate. They weren't convinced. So the men gave their gold for the golden calf. When it came to building the tabernacle, it was built out of the gold that the women had. For the Mishkan, for the tabernacle, they donated their gold, which had not been wasted on the golden calf. That's a simple enough answer, but the commentaries say another thing. The men also had some gold to contribute to the tabernacle. It's the gold, interesting description here, it's the gold that people carry in their bosom pocket wrapped in a cloth. That gold they did not give to the golden calf. That was saved for the tabernacle, for the Mishkan. There's a certain love, a certain kind of emotional warmth that can be used publicly. It may even get squandered or abused. It may even get invested into idolatrous kinds of things. It's a corruptible kind of thing because it's a public emotion. It's an emotion that is meant to be worn on the outside. It's an emotion that is meant to be displayed. But then there's a gold that even the reckless, even the idolatrous do not give away carelessly. It's the gold carried in the bosom pocket near the heart and kept wrapped in a cloth. That's the intimate gold, the intimate emotion. When you take that emotion out, when you expose it, when you move it away from the heart, it stops being intimate. It is corrupted. It hardens, it becomes calloused, and becomes part of the public domain. you no longer have an intimate space. In the tabernacle that they built, there was an outer chamber and an inner chamber. The outer chamber was called the place of holiness. The inner chamber was called the Holy of Holies. And between them there was a curtain. Even between holy and Holy of Holies, there needs to be modesty, a curtain, a closing. And then, on the holiest day of the year, the holiest member of the congregation would go into the holiest place of the tabernacle and there perform the Yom Kippur service. That was the moment of intimacy. So, intimacy is a prerequisite for sexuality. And modesty is a prerequisite for intimacy. We cannot be intimate if we are totally exposed. We cannot be intimate if we won't allow at least one other person into our intimate space. And when we do that, then the sexuality is true sexuality, not just being physical. So, closing a door should be recognized as a sexual event. Are you really prepared for this? Is it permissible? Is it proper? If not, leave the door open. Should we shake hands, men and women? Should it be seen as an intimate gesture? Should any physical contact that is friendly be considered intimate? Hopefully. They cover everything. They sin. It's a little more cumbersome, but they do. They manage. Modesty does not prevent sin. That's not its purpose. Modesty prevents the overexposure of the place of intimacy, emotional, physical, and so on, that preserves our sexuality, not prevents it. So should shaking hands be considered intimate? I would hope so. I asked this guy who was complaining about the wall in the synagogue, would you like to belong to a congregation where men and women sit together in kind of cramped quarters, bench, pews, and somebody has to leave early, and the man is sitting there and he's concentrating on his prayers, and somebody has to leave early and is kind of squeezing pie, and he doesn't notice whether it's a man or a woman. Would you want to belong to such a congregation? Would you want to be able to keep your mind on the prayers? I wouldn't. Human sexuality is what God wants. God doesn't despise it. In fact, He gives us laws of modesty to preserve it and enhance it, not to stifle it. We find it much more stifling when we are callous about it. And even in marriage, casual contact, a kiss on the run, this ruins everything. It cheapens it. It makes it callous. And then people have to run to the therapist and ask for advice. You know what advice they get from therapists? For $200 an hour? They are told not to touch each other for 2 weeks. No touch at all. So gosh, Judaism says that for free. That there are 2 weeks out of every month that a husband and wife don't touch? Free. It's been around for 3,000 years. And it still works. It's a wonderful idea. When you don't close the door, you are recognizing your own sexuality. You are complementing by recognizing the sexuality of the other person. You say, one second, we can't close the door because you're a man, I'm a woman. We can't. Instead of saying, let's see, you're kind of overweight. Yeah, close the door. That's a terrible insult. And again, it isn't really true. So being modest, recognizing our borders, knowing where intimacy begins, and not waiting until it is so intimate that we're too far gone to stop, is a very healthy way of living And it's a very healthy way of raising our children. Tell a child about modesty. Don't tell them about perverts out there who molest children. Tell them that there's such a thing as modesty. And they'll know themselves. As soon as something gets a little bit immodest, they'll know that they have to leave. This is not for them. And they don't need to be told about perversions, only about modesty. And you'll see there's a certain light, there's a certain warmth, trust, and joy in the eyes of a child who knows modesty. They can relax. They know their borders. They know right from wrong, and they can be comfortable. Take a look at children who have been given all these little booklets about how to prevent 6-year-olds. We're told how to prevent molestations and how to avoid strangers who are out to get you, and their eyes are vacant. There is no warmth there. There's no trust there. There's no joy there. They're efficient, but they're not intimate. And they're going to grow up, and they're going to need to have intimate relationships, and they're going to have problems. So let's do two things. First of all, identify. Belong. The more the better. This is my synagogue. This is my people. This is my rabbi. I may hate them all, but they're mine. This woman says, well, what, if my kids are brats, I should put up with them? What's the question? Your neighbor's kids are brats, don't put up with it. But your kids are brats? Of course you put up with it. What's the question? So you may be annoyed, you may be drained at the end of the day, you may be exhausted, you may be disappointed, disillusioned, but you're alive. You belong, you know where you belong. Identify. Be proud of the identification. Thrive on it, because we need it desperately. And secondly, treat it with modesty. Treat yourself with modesty. It enhances your life. It doesn't change your lifestyle dramatically, but enhances it dramatically. And we come away more able to relax, better able to be spontaneous, because we know that we can trust ourselves. We've defined our borders. Now you can be free. It's taking a load off your conscience, and it makes you a much more lovable person. You have a very useful and helpful resource here in town at the Chabad House. Go there, study, identify, belong, make a connection. Don't be alone in any area of your life. Belong, and belong modesty. Okay. Such a provoking talk, I'm sure there must be lots of questions. Who's got a question?
going to start at the front here. Yes.
Michelle Cheney. Michelle Cheney, Keble College. Oh, okay. I have a question about when you said that we had the freedom to choose where we belong. And to me, belonging means acceptance. So, for instance, I could say that I want to belong to her, I want to be her friend. But if she does not accept me, then I do not belong to her. And I was wondering if it would be more accurate to say that we have the freedom to accept who belongs to us.
This freedom to belong, to bond, is of course enhanced when it's a two-way street. Fortunately or unfortunately, we are able to belong to someone even if they don't want us to. That's not the positive side of that freedom of choice, but we are capable of doing it, unfortunately, and often do, and get into a lot of trouble because of it. So this capacity to belong is a very powerful one. When we don't use it correctly, it creates weird kinds of relationships. Psychologists have words for these kinds of relationship terms to describe them. So yeah, it would be a lot nicer if it was reciprocal, but it can unfortunately be an attachment that is an unhealthy one because it is not being reciprocated. Also, we have the freedom to allow into our lives selectively, cautiously, and should be. And that's the modesty part. The modesty means I have a curtain, and nobody enters beyond that curtain unless they're invited. Another thing about modesty is that I won't look behind that curtain unless I'm invited. And if you apply that to marriage, for example, the husband who senses that his wife is kind of being mysterious or secretive about a certain thing in her life becomes determined to find out what that is. That's not nice. If she puts up a curtain and says, please don't peek behind here, I'm a little bit embarrassed by what I've got behind this particular curtain. He says, oh really? What are you hiding? Well, whatever it is, she's hiding it. Leave it alone. Why do we always have to go looking for that part of the other person that they don't want to display? Why can't we appreciate the part that is being shared, that is being offered? Why do we have to be curious about the little piece that's being saved? Every person has the right to keep the curtain wherever they want it. We don't have to be our spouse's psychologist or psychiatrist. If they have a certain sensitivity, support the sensitivity. If they're putting up a facade, if they're wearing a mask because they feel uncomfortable about something, you're not there to rip it off. That's not your job, not your place. That's disloyal. Modesty means you appreciate people as they present themselves. You don't go peeking for those parts that they're trying to hide. They're hiding it for a good reason. It's embarrassing.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Marcus Roberts of Pembroke College. I'd like to ask you more about the spiritual dimension of sexuality. I mean, obviously, a lot of what you're saying is predicated on some link to nature of God and whatever, and obviously the kind of modesty you're talking about has significance, you know, with one's spiritual and religious life. You haven't said a lot about that. Could you elaborate?
Well, if you want to appreciate the spiritual aspect of sexuality, by nature, rationally speaking, familiarity leads to the inevitable contempt. No one is for long a hero to his personal valet, I think it's been said. Marriage is the most intense kind of familiarity, the most total familiarity, and yet it does not lead to contempt. There's something mystical about that right there. There's something spiritual about it. And as we were saying before, if an abused child has, there are common symptoms among abused children. One of the symptoms is nightmares in which the victim, the abused child, even later on as an adult, sees themselves running down a corridor with many doors. And they try one door after another, and they're all locked. And they keep running, looking for that door that will open. And the way it's understood is that the door is the door to their privacy. That's what a door means. Now, an abused child has had their privacy violated. And so what used to be their door, what used to keep their private, is no longer. So now they're looking for a new privacy. They're looking for a new door that will protect their private place. When someone treats your privacy as if it were not private, as if it were public property, it destroys the privacy. Now, in marriage, the idea is that you invite a stranger. You're not allowed to marry your brother or sister. You have to marry a stranger. You invite a stranger into the most intimate places in your existence, and it remains intimate. It remains private. There's a miracle there. And the only way to explain it is that there's a spiritual dimension that enters into the most physical activities and gives it the properties of the spirit rather than of the body. The body is violated. How can it still experience privacy and intimacy and so on? Because when done properly, marriage turns the physical into something more. It attains spiritual properties. And the truth is that the longer you're married, the more you share the most private and most intimate things, the more private they become. It's not a compromise at all, not even a kosher compromise. You're not compromising anything. It becomes more and more intimate. And if there's pain, the pain makes it more intimate. So marriage really means that you can find someone who will bond with you, belong with you, even after they see those parts of yourself that even you can't stand looking at. So if you get over the fear of exposing that part of yourself, not only doesn't it compromise your privacy, it bonds you together so deeply that at the end of 70 or 80 years, you have really merged into one flesh. And maybe that's why the Bible uses that expression. A man and woman are to become one flesh, not one spirit. Because spirits becoming one is no problem. Spirits naturally blend. But bodies becoming one, this is a physical impossibility, unless you bring a spiritual element into the physical. So there's enough there to satisfy even the most mystical soul. Mystics should get married.
Another question. Could you pass it back? Yes.
David Keane, Oriel College. What you were saying about commitment to relationships and being able to opt out of them and throw away commitment to an extent. I mean, we don't have a system of arranged marriages here in the West, and that partly gives us the ability to opt in or opt out of relationships. Do you think that that system, by taking away the ability to opt out, would actually deal with a lot of the problems that you mentioned with intimacy?
I think so. I think it would force us to take our relationships more seriously. I think the relationship would develop more quickly because we wouldn't have all this time to play at the relationship. In fact, the whole idea of working on a relationship is another concept we should do away with. What do you mean you're working on a relationship? What does that mean? Do you like this person or don't you? What does it mean that you work at it? You don't like them, but you're trying to? What work is there that goes into a relationship? It almost sounds like I'm seriously contemplating taking a calculated risk at liking someone whom I don't trust. And so I'm discussing it with my therapist. I'm talking about it to my mother. And we're posturing, basically, for safety. I'm trying to work it out so that if I do treat the other person nicely, if I do get friendly, I want to work it out that I get more out of the relationship than the other. Because if they're getting more than me, then I'm being had. I'm being taken advantage of. I'm allowing myself to be abused. Horrible thing to do. And so this is what working at a relationship means. It means I'm working to prevent a relationship from getting out of hand, meaning getting real, getting serious. So working on a relationship is nonsense. Do you like this person? Do you think you can make a go of it, a lifetime project out of this? Is this the kind of person who fits into your family? Is this a marriage? It's not a marriage, then don't play at it. If it is a marriage, get real, get serious. I think it would cut out a lot of aggravation, a lot of heartache, a lot of frustration, a lot of wasted energy. I think it would take a load off our shoulders, and we would learn how to breathe again. Most people walk around not breathing. Can't afford to.
Partner with Rabbi Friedman. Visit itsgoodtoknow.org/support.